Welcome everybody. I'm going to get started. My name is Sue Scull and I run the Research Education Program here at the Child and Adolescent Health Service. And what we do over the course of the year is deliver over 20 different seminars that each touch on different points in the research process. And in just an hour, each time we cover a really huge topic. So it's only ever going to be an overview, but we try and keep things as practical as possible and try and give you with some practical tools going forward so that you can avoid some of the common pitfalls. And we also put quite a bit of effort into our handout. So at the back of the PowerPoint slides, you'll always find additional resources and useful websites, and if we know about them, other training opportunities. Because we use telehealth to beam this all around WA, we'll ask you to hold your questions to the end, and it's also why I have to stay glued to the microphone here, because we record this and put it onto our website. So you'll always find all our seminars on our website at any one time. You can go there if you've missed them or want to catch up on something, but the way to get the latest version of everything is to come along. We also very much appreciate your feedback. So at the end of the talk, there'll be a little URL that you can go to and just tick some boxes for a few quick questions. We really do take on board your feedback because we want to continuously improve what we do. So just take a moment at the end if you have time to fill that in, and we email it out to you if you've registered in advance. So this is a hugely important topic, and I think it's true that in Western countries the fear of presenting in public or public speaking is rated the highest of all fears, even above the fear of death, which is pretty high up there. So I think it's good to be well prepared, and I think by the end of this 1 hour you'll hopefully see that practice and preparation is really important to give you confidence going forward. So what I'm going to cover today is just practical stuff as much as possible, and we'll talk about the content of the typical talk, and I'm going to focus on the sort of talk that we would do at a conference or, for example, to your department, where you might have to speak for a short time or a long time, but the general structure is always the same and the general strategies around presenting are always the same as well. We'll talk a little about the tools and the environment that you speak in, the tools that you use to deliver, and also a little bit about different styles for presenting and techniques for presenting, and then talk about the pointy end of your talk, which is question time, and whether you are the chairperson of a session or you have a chairperson for your session at a conference, how you can use that role to the best of your ability. And of course we'll talk a bit about confidence. But first of all, I want to show you the entire talk, which is just 6 slides that a colleague of mine used to teach me oral presentation, and he's an amazing speaker. He, in fact, doesn't use PowerPoint at all, and I use it by way of demonstration. Well, he does, he has 6 slides, but he really hates PowerPoint, and what he likes to do is really interact with his audience, and he actually delivers the whole talk walking around the room, interacting with people. He actually has a broomstick with a little, I guess, piece of paper on the top with 6 dot points on it, and that's all he uses for the whole hour and a half that he delivers on oral presentation. And it's really just to say to you there are different ways of delivering talks, and when you're very confident and a great speaker, you don't actually need a lot of crutches or prompts. So these are Malcolm McDonald's slides. So he talks about presenting as being an opportunity, not something to be frightened of. And it does make us focus on our work and think about what we want to get out of it at the end. It shows our peers and colleagues what you're capable of doing and producing. And it's obviously a great way to get your message across to all the people involved in your research or your study. It's important also because by getting your work out there, it will stop others unnecessarily duplicating the exact same study. And of course, for you personally, you get feedback on your work and new ideas about where to take it next. And ultimately, as for all research, what we're trying to do is impact on policy and practice. And the best way to do that is get feedback from people as well. He also talks about respect, so respect for all the people involved in your project, so for you, the work that you've completed, all the people that have sponsored you and helped you, your audience out there, and of course all your participants. And I think this is a really important statement, that everyone wasn't born a good speaker. Most people are quite bad to start with, And the more you practice and prepare, the better you get at it over time. And making mistakes is a good way to learn going forward. And this is important too. So the audience doesn't come along to your talk to give you a hard time and make you feel small. The audience comes along because they think you know more than they do, and that's generally the case. So you should always look at them as being not too scary rather than being worried about it. And really what you're doing is simply telling a story and having a clear introduction and background, then giving people the guts of what you've found from your research, and then hammering home some clear take-home messages. So it is just like any other story, and you just have to think about it in a scientific, objective way. And again, he emphasised a lot about keeping things simple. So you don't need to wrap it on about the same point over and over or use more words than are necessary, particularly in a scientific world. And so Malcolm, year after year, won the best teacher, and that was his whole talk. And that went for an hour and a half, that talk, with 6 slides and a broomstick and some dot points on top of it. And he was brilliant at moderating his voice, interacting with people. He liked a more workshop-y kind of environment, and he really actively disliked PowerPoint. But that's not for everyone. He was a great natural speaker and very confident at speaking. So everyone has to find their own path. And with that in mind, I'm going to talk a bit about PowerPoint, because the bottom line is that PowerPoint is very frequently used. It's what most people expect. And when used well, it's fantastic. And when used badly, it's just terrible. And we've all been to talks like this one where people literally turn around and read out every single word on the slide. And that's really boring, and it totally disconnects the audience. And one of the things that can be very bad about PowerPoint is this idea of the cognitive load theory. And I guess an extreme view is this one here, where PowerPoint is so bad that we shouldn't use it at all. And I don't agree with that. I think when used well, it can be very helpful for you as a prompt and for your audience just to see where you are and where you are in the story, if you like. But I'd like you to read this first so that you can see why PowerPoint can be a problem. Has everyone read that? And has everybody experienced that? That when someone is literally reading every word but you're reading it at a different speed, it's actually quite frustrating. And also read this. So that really makes sense to me, that idea that if someone's simply reading what's on the slide and you're reading it as well, then it's difficult to listen and read at the same time. And in addition, if I had my way, and I have tried this but failed dismally because people love handouts and they want them at the start, but ideally in good teaching you would give the handout at the end. And I can tell you that everything I'm saying is in this handout and you don't need to write on it. But if you were trying to read the handout, write on the handout, read the slides and listen to me, your brain is going into overload, and it's actually quite hard to do. You're actually better off just listening to the speaker and referring occasionally to where we are in the story to absorb the information better. So keep that in mind when you're presenting. So despite all of the negatives of PowerPoint, we are going to get on with a whole lot of practical tips related to presenting using PowerPoint, or whichever method you would like, because at the end of the day, this is what people use and expect. So what about the content in the average talk? So in general, it's a little bit like paper, and what we're going to talk about is choosing and organising the material with some key headings, drilling down on key messages, and I really encourage you to come along to Elizabeth Chester's fantastic talk coming up very soon from Telethon Kids. She's the head of communications there, and she does a fantastic talk on using the media and comms team to your advantage to maximise getting your results out there into the wider world, and tips on focusing your message and hammering it home and getting it absorbed and out there. And just like Winston Churchill said, don't be afraid to repeat your message. So it's really important to come up with a few key points that you want people to go home with and hammer them home, repeat them more than once. in the allocated time. So think about any conference you've ever been to, especially if they go for 2 or 3 days, and by the end of it someone says, what did you learn? You'd be lucky if you could reel off 3 things that you remembered that's going to make a difference for you. So don't think that in your talk you can give people 50 take-home points that they're going to remember, because they won't. So focus on the most important and make sure they go home with that information. So this old saying, tell them what you're going to tell them, then tell them what you've just told them, is exactly what you do in a presentation, whether it's 8 minutes long or an hour long. And that's what I did at the start. I gave you my overview slide, and I'm going to give you the content. At the end, I'll give you my take-home messages. Be aware of your audience. So if you're going to a conference or presenting in another hospital, be clear about who it is you're talking to. So when I first started giving these talks, I would ask who's from here and who's from there, and now I know this is like the toughest gig there is, because we have people from every clinical background, from laboratory to medical, nursing, allied health, pharmacy, and we have students right up through to heads of departments. So it's about as broad as you can get. So being able to pitch it at the right level is quite hard sometimes, but the most important points are never talk down to your audience, because your audience is invariably very smart. But on the other hand, don't assume they know everything about your topic as well as you do. And I'll get on to things like jargon and acronyms and abbreviations later on, because it's very important that you build up from a level that everyone can understand and then adjust according to your audience in terms of the speed of the information that you provide. Think about cultural issues. So we're not doing much travelling at the moment, but regardless, we might be talking to communities, we might be talking to scientists, we might be talking to politicians, it could be executive. You need to think about different issues for different audiences, but particularly when you're talking to people of different cultural backgrounds, you do need to think about the way you speak, make eye contact, the volume at which you speak, etc. So for some people, being very casual is not good. So Australians typically are pretty laid back. When we talk overseas, we often drop titles, use first names, and that's really not the done thing in some other countries. People like to be called professor and like to be referred to by their surname. In other countries, yelling at people at full volume and full pace is not considered very nice either. So using spaces and pauses and moderating your voice might be quite important. So do think about all those things, and if you're not sure, you should actually clarify with whoever it is who's asked you to talk or whoever's giving the conference. Ask them what the audience is going to be like and whether there are any things you need to consider before you charge off and do it just the way you would normally do it with your own department, for example. So the acronyms, abbreviations and jargon are best avoided. So not only do we have inter-country differences in the acronyms that we use, we have interstate differences, and we have even differences between health service providers or between paediatrics and adult medicine or whatever it might be. So remember, you're very immersed in your area of research. You know what all those acronyms and what all that jargon means, but 90% of your audience might not, and it is not okay to just put a whole list of acronyms up on your first slide and then charge off for an hour using those acronyms, assuming everybody knows what you're talking about, because you've probably immediately lost them. And I've been to many talks like that where I missed the first slide or there were too many acronyms to remember, and then I simply don't know what they're talking about for most of the talk. I've even seen titles. I saw one a couple of years ago from our hospital that was a whole bunch of acronyms, acronyms unpicked, and I thought, why would I go to this talk? I don't even know what it's about. So you have to really beware, and particularly in titles, and I hope that wasn't your talk, but I just remember being incredulous when I saw it. Also, just general waffle, don't pad things out too much. In science and in academia, we try and be succinct and objective and say it simply and stop. It's hard to do, but particularly for very short conference presentations, you might only have 7 or 8 minutes, and you want to have some time at the end for discussion. So you need to be able to get your message across succinctly. All right, so the typical outline, as I mentioned, is a bit like a peer-reviewed paper for a scientific journal. And depending on the length of your talk, it might cover, you might have slides on all of these things, or you might have many slides on the methods or several slides on the results. But if you've only got a very short amount of time, you might have to condense some of these things. So typically you might be condensing the introduction and the aims, or maybe the discussion and the summary, or in a very short talk you might put the acknowledgement slide up at the end, but not read it all out, because that's actually not interesting for most people, but as long as it's there, that's good, and you could be asking for questions already during that slide being up. So just like a paper, and you just have to think about each section, which we're going to talk about. So, as I said, the title is really important in terms of getting people to hear about your work. You want people to come to your talk, and you want people to understand what it's about, which is why you don't put the acronyms and abbreviations in it. Many people use the same approach as for a catchy paper in a peer-reviewed journal. So you might have some eye-catching little phrase and a colon, but then it's very important to have a clear description about what the talk covers and implicitly what it doesn't cover. So for example, that one down on the bottom left from David Bergner's group, who used to work here, is an update on Kawasaki disease. So if you just stopped there and you thought, great, I need to find out all the latest on treatment of Kawasaki disease, and you went along and it was all about etiology and pathogenesis, you'd be pretty disappointed. So having a complete title that encompasses what is covered is actually really important. And then people come to your talk knowing what they're going to get, and they'll be happy with what they get. And some of these other ones I picked just because sometimes you can have really catchy, but it doesn't necessarily contain all the information you need. And perhaps the one down the bottom right is very clever, but not everybody might know what it's about, for example. Whereas the top left one, Children and Guns, A Call to Disarm, we can see exactly what it's about and what the author's angle is going to be. Now, the introduction is also important, because this is where you get across how exciting this topic is, why you wanted to study it in the first place, why this research is so important, because you set out what we know, what is the state of evidence at the moment, what's missing, and therefore why you did this study and what your study is going to add when you get the data at the other end. And at the end of that introduction, you should at least have a clear statement of the objectives of your project so that people really understand why this is important. This is where you grab people's attention or you lose them altogether. Methods, one of my other hats is as a clinical epidemiologist, so obviously I'm biased and I think methods are critical, but they could also take up your whole 10-minute talk if you covered everything on this list. So sometimes you need to summarise very briefly and just have a few dot points, but if you've got a half-an-hour talk, it's actually pretty important to cover as much detail as you can, being reasonable to all the other areas you've got to cover, because at the end of the day your audience needs to know, can I apply these results in my setting? Are the participants sufficiently similar? So what were the inclusion and exclusion criteria for these participants, and where were they? Was it in a hospital or in the community or in another country altogether? And then you also want to know things like, are these data going to be robust enough for me to trust them? So you do want to know things like, did they pilot the study and therefore iron out all their problems? Did they have a sample size built around the main objective, and then did they meet that sample size later on when the results are discussed, so that you know whether you can be reasonably confident in those results. And you would normally put in your ethics approval at whatever level that is, whether it's an audit approval through GECO, for example, here in WA Health, or whether it's a Human Research Ethics Committee approval. So think about all these things and allowing people to either replicate the study themselves or decide the data are no good for them in their setting, or at least give them the impression that your data are sufficiently good that they will trust the results. Now, I know this is obvious that you should report the results in the results section, but people often start doing major interpretations in the results section, and maybe in a very short conference presentation you're going to have to put it up there, pre-digest it and interpret it all at the same time, because you've only got 5 minutes, the 5-minute PhD talk, for example. But if you've got longer, you really need to focus on only presenting the results in this section as objectively as you can and not interpreting them. Do that in the discussion section. That's the critical thinking part. So if you're presenting the results, be scientifically objective and present them in a logical order. And we normally start with our primary objective first and work through to our secondary or tertiary objectives when we're presenting results. And we also work through from the most simple to the most complex. So we would normally start with a bit about the participation rate. So who did we recruit, or who was eligible, who did we recruit and who completed? And then a simple description of who's in the study, things like gender, age, comorbidity, and then work through to more complicated things where you look at how some factors influenced your main outcome. So that might be your logistic regression things. And be very consistent also with presentation, not just in terms of order, so your primary, secondary objectives, but also things like decimal points and confidence intervals can be presented with hyphens or commas or 1 decimal point, 3 decimal points. You need to keep it consistent all the way through and as easy to read as possible on the screen and to digest when you're presenting. And do think about presentation options. So I cover this in a lot more detail in our scientific writing seminar, because it's the same idea for publication for a paper, that you need to think about the easiest way to get the results across. But the bottom line is, in a presentation, a picture tells 1,000 words, and you can put a graph up there, pre-digest a lot of the information that's on there for your audience and just focus on the key things, but then they can look at other stuff if they want. But you do need to be very careful about what we call in the business chart junk. So it's so complicated or fancy or has all these special effects that it's actually hard to quickly and easily pick out the data that is being talked about. And do make sure things have complete titles so people know it's about whatever section of your project and in this setting and at this time, and that you use colours that show up and fonts that are easy to read. So you'll notice on my slides that I don't use Times New Roman in the way back when people used to do that, and anything with little extra bits on it is harder to process quickly, and many talks are very quick. So do think about that. I've got this really old example which I like. It has nothing to do with health research, but just to show you very simply that on the top right, when you use pie charts, you'll find it quite difficult, even with colours that all stand out from each other, to separate out amounts that are similar. So for example, here we've got Army, Navy, Air Force, Marines, and Air Force and Navy are very similar in size, and if you were just looking at that, you wouldn't really be sure which is bigger, and you'd have to read the 26 and 27% anyway. And it's even worse when you go over to the top left with the three-dimensional pie charts. You could be forgiven for thinking that the Air Force section was bigger than the Navy or even than the Army because of the three-dimensional effect. So it's not a good way to present data because it's confusing and hard to quickly absorb as a snapshot. And remember, you know your data, your audience has never seen it before, so it's got to be super simple. So even bottom left, that three-dimensional histogram or bar chart, reading across the tops of those three-dimensional columns is actually harder to do than a really boring two-dimensional one on the bottom right, which is actually the easiest way to present your data. And that could be made even better by putting things in size order or alphabetical order or whatever makes sense to you. But you've got to think about your audience quickly being able to interpret what's up there. And you'd have to agree that it's very easy to see which one's bigger than the other. And this is just comparing two different times. So even with the two-dimensional easy visuals here, I couldn't tell you that the Navy had gone from 27 to 29 without reading it, whereas you can tell on the bar chart that they're different depending on your scale. That scale could be a lot better on that histogram actually because they're too far apart. But just to show you that visually, so don't use pie charts, don't use three-dimensional effects, and don't use this sort of thing. So Ollie and I were looking at his data from a recent audit that he did, and he just loves playing around with data. I didn't tell him I was going to show you these, but these are nuts, and I didn't know what was going on. It made no sense to me, so we ended up with two-dimensional histograms. like always. But that's the sort of thing you can do in programs now, but it doesn't mean it's easy for your audience to understand. And those were just simple proportions for a whole lot of outcomes that we looked at. Okay, so a bit on the conclusion. So as I said, this is the critical thinking part. People want to know what you think, what did your data mean? And again, logical order. You should hit them in your first sentence with the main outcome from our primary objective was X, and I expected or didn't expect to find this based on the literature, and then go through all your different objectives and what each of them are going to mean for current practice or policy or recommendations, and then talk about the strengths and limitations of your study. Did you meet your sample size? Did you really have enough power to talk about your tertiary objective number 5? Was your recruitment very poor? Was your participation group not representative? All that kind of stuff. And don't exaggerate, and don't focus all your energy on some little minor objective that your study was never designed to answer, but it was something interesting that you found. If you find interesting stuff, by all means mention it, but just say, well, this was interesting, but our study wasn't designed to answer this question, but we might look at it in future. It's a hypothesis generating bit of information. And never say more research is needed or I will hunt you down, unless you are very, very specific. So if you've just done a study and you think it's the definitive clinical trial and no one else should ever do one of these ever again, then just say, we think this study was sufficiently good that the only work that needs to be done now is a meta-analysis of all the existing randomised controlled trials and we've got our definitive answer. Or I've just done this descriptive audit and we hypothesise that our results mean X, and the next thing we need to do is a prospective cohort study or maybe a randomised controlled trial to see if this change in practice results in an improvement in outcomes for our patients. But don't just say more research is needed. And you do see a lot of people just finish with that and you go, well, blah, what does that mean? I don't know what I need to go do now. So do try and really think about it. The critical thinking at the end of your study is very important. Okay, and think about a handout. So you don't need one for conferences where they have a big conference book and you're allowed to have your abstract in. But having said that, technology fails frequently and you need a backup, or your audience might need a backup if you end up with no slides or something else happens. Also with handouts you can put more information like your contact details, which can be great if you want people who are shy that haven't asked a question but get in contact with you later, or maybe a collaboration will come out of it. You can put more graphs, you can put more information in general, you can put references, whatever you want. So that can be a good thing to have at a conference as well to go with your presentation. Oh, and now I want to talk about practice. So this will come up over and over again in this talk because it's so important. And think about who you can practice your talk to before you stand up and what you will ask those people to check for. Because there's nothing more useless than going to the effort of presenting it to your department and everyone goes, that was great. And because that's not helpful. And there's always something that can be improved, and that happens a lot. So think about practicing to someone who's going to give you honest feedback, and ideally peers, content experts, but maybe someone who knows nothing about your topic, because remember, we can be over-invested and use the jargon and all the rest of it, or it might just not be very clear. And it's better to present to more than one person, but if all else fails, present to yourself. So it's pretty easy these days to record yourself in some way or another, or even present into the mirror, and you will soon discover, as I have over the years, that I still say a lot, I fidget, I had to get rid of the pen that I used to play with all the time. There's lots of little annoying things that you do. Perhaps you're not keeping your eyes up and not making eye contact, or you're mumbling, or you're looking down. There's lots of things that you pick up, or simply that the talk doesn't flow very well. So when I did my Masters of Epidemiology at ANU, one of the best things they did in that course was get in an amazing media person to come and teach us about public speaking. And we were all terrible, but what they made us do, because we were a pretty small group, was allocate each person to a different role, and this is useful. So get someone to simply look at the timing. Did you spend enough time on each section? Did you finish on time? Did you talk too fast? All that sort of stuff. Someone on science and logic, did it make sense? Was it in a logical order? Did I understand it? Was the terminology okay? Someone who just looks at slide content. So were there too many dot points? Were the tables impossible to understand or too complex? Were the colours wrong? Could you see the graph data properly? Were there typographical mistakes? Style is all about you, so that's the umming and the ahhing and the fidgeting and the mumbling and the looking away. So that's useful feedback, as are getting someone to think about the sorts of questions that might be asked at the end of your talk and to actually ask you and see how you respond to them in a practice setting. And then someone just to look at the overall impression, like did it make sense? Was there anything missing? That kind of thing. What would they change? So that's much more powerful than just randomly presenting to your department or wherever you work and then getting everyone to just say, yeah, that was fine, wouldn't change a thing. It's very unlikely. So timing is critical. Do you finish early? Do you finish bang on time, or is it okay to go over a bit? It's actually really important to leave time at the end and to never go over time. So how do we stop ourselves leaving, how do we make ourselves rather leave time at the end? We practice, and we practice out loud. That's really important. How many of you have ever practiced a talk just by reading it in your head and then got up there and gone, whatever did I mean by putting that dot point up there, and I don't really know what I'm going to say now. So practice speaking it out loud, as painful as that is, and I still do that because every year I completely change my talks and I don't know how long they're going to take, and if there's one talk that I want to finish on time, it's this one, without any technological stuff-ups. And also edit, so you'll find that some things can come out if it's too long, and if it's too short, then think about why is it too short. Is it content? Are you speaking too fast? What is it that is leaving half an hour at the end of a 1 hour talk instead of 5 minutes or 10 minutes? So why shouldn't we go over time? Well, the most important one is at the bottom, because the valuable feedback you get from your talk is during question time. But also, particularly for conferences, it's incredibly disruptive and rude if you hog someone else's time after you. If there are concurrent sessions, someone's come to listen to you, but they desperately want to get to the one after you in the next session, and you've used up all that extra time, and then the person after you loses their question time. So it's really unprofessional and leaves a bad impression, whereas if you finish on time or early, that leaves a good impression that you're organised. And then question time, which I'm going to come to, very important. So just a little bit on the tools and the environment. If you've never spoken in the space where you're going to talk, go and check it out first. So for example, when people come here, I tell them that all these little people are going to pop up on your screen when you least expect it, because they'll be joining from outside at random times, and they'll forget to turn off their video, or they'll forget to turn off their microphone. And don't worry, Chris is going to take care of that in audio-visual. And we also say stay at the microphone because we're recording and all the other things. It's good to know how big the room is and how far you need to project and where you need to look. So the worst one I ever had was when I was very junior and I went to a very big conference in Queensland, and thank goodness I went out and had a look first, because when you went to the lectern, instead of looking ahead and seeing your audience, there was a huge hole like where the football team ran out, and then the seats were on both sides, so you had to be able to talk that way and that way. And on top of that, there was no monitor, so you had to actually turn around away from the microphone and somehow engage your audience in two directions and read your slides from up there, which was horrible, really badly organised. But at least I knew in advance. And the other thing that happens is checking your presentation on a particular computer. So sometimes you'll find that for whatever reason there are all these animations you didn't realise you'd put on your dot points, or the videos don't work, or the internet connection isn't going to work, and you need to know that in advance. So do check in advance, and anyone who's ever been in theatre will say they always check out the space first, try and get their voice up the back of the room and understand where people are going to be. Also know about linking. So, for example, this is recorded, so can't move away from the microphone. This is telehealth all around the state. So I need to know that at the end of the talk there are people who might be asking questions from a different computer or via the AV guys up the back. And we need to tell people about noise and interrupting during the talk, etc., etc. So do know what you're doing in advance and ask if you're not sure. All right, this is all obvious stuff about the tools of presenting and nothing you won't know already. But just remember that whilst the lectern is useful for your glass of water or your laptop, if you prefer to use a laptop, or your notes or your backup plan, whatever that is, it can also be a barrier. Like here on the bottom right, if you're short, you're going to have to stand to the side, you're going to have to adjust your microphone, you're going to have to get it right for you. So unexpected things happen sometimes. Pointers, we used to use laser pointers, hate laser pointers. These days we mostly use the mouse. This one's really hard to use, and Chris explained to me today why it's so hard, is that it works fine on here, but on here there's this huge delay because the video's going out, coming back. So that can be difficult. But in the old days, people used to, if you have a bit of a tremor or you're wildly flaying it around, you're pointing it in people's eyes, that's not very good. And it's very distracting. So if you are nervous and you are shaking, you're probably better off not using the pointer. And the microphone, you just need to know, am I using a lapel microphone? As a fixed microphone, can I walk up and down with my lapel, or do I have to stay here? And is there feedback? Are there problems with it? Is it going to work? Are people going to hear you? And some people start at the beginning by saying, can you hear me all right? All right, slides. This is really important and really simple, but I do see almost everyday presentations, I think, I can't read that, that's too small, or that's the wrong colour. So just my practice is that I try and keep dot points to less than 8 per slide. I try and have less than 8 words per dot point. If I can't fit it in less than 8 words, then I edit it. Because it's a prompt for me and a prompt for you. It's not for me to read, so it doesn't have to be a complete sentence. I keep that all the dot points at 24 font. So again, if I can't fit what I need to say in 24 font, I'm trying to say too much on one slide, or I'm using too many words. And I keep my headings around 32 or 36, and I keep it the same all the way through. So it's actually a bit distracting when you go slide to slide to slide, especially for a long talk. If every slide is different, it kind of looks messy. So it's just about being consistent and avoiding all those crazy, colourful, creative backgrounds and wacko flying dot points and animations and things. I see talks like that all the time too, and you actually get very distracted by them. And do have a backup plan if the technology fails. So as I said, it's always wise to come with a printout of your talk in case something goes wrong, so that even if you have to look down and turn the pages, you've still got it in big enough font that you can read it and deliver a talk. So we have had technological stuff-ups in here where the presenters just have to ad-lib for a while we try and fix things, and that can happen anywhere. So do have a backup plan, have your laptop or your USB or whatever it is in case they put up the wrong version. That happened at a talk yesterday, someone put up the wrong version, they quickly put their USB in and off they went. So think about the colours. Like I said, it's hard to read colours that totally disengage the audience. They can't see what you're talking about, and you don't need to get super arty on everyone. In the old days we used to have those royal blue backgrounds with the yellow writing, and now most people just use black on white, and that's fine, you can read it and avoid crazy backgrounds. And I've just put this in for fun to show you a bad slide with lots of far too many dot points and words and too small and a busy background, and then all these things you can do with your dot points. If you didn't know you could do this, you can do this. And I have seen whole talks where every dot point bounces in or turns around or does all these really stupid things, and it's distracting, and you don't need it. They're supposed to be listening to you and not looking at all that stuff. So even on the right there, you can see that it's better if it's black on a light background, and you've got to get the size right as well. And don't use backgrounds like that. All right. Delivery style. So, as I said at the very beginning of this talk, everybody is different and you're different, and just find the style that works for you in terms of talking to your audience. And really just remember the audience is there to be nice to you, not nasty, and be yourself and practice. For really nervous people, it's a good idea, just like theatre performance, to have looked at the space you're going to talk to, and when you come in, just take a moment, look around, see who's there, find a couple of friendly faces and take a big deep breath. Some people say it's a good idea to yawn before you go on because that relaxes the whole body. If you're still feeling really pressured and nervous, just say something like, "Thank you for coming today," or "Thank you for inviting me to speak," and check the clock. So one of the first things we did here was put that clock in the back so that the speaker could see how they were tracking and that they would have enough time. And if you go and check out your speaking space and there's no clock, at least have your watch or something like well, phones aren't good actually because the screen will go blank, but something where you can see the time and check how you're going. And yeah, smile even if you don't feel like it, and just take a moment and then off you go. And think about the way you speak. So as I said, I have seen people come in here and say to me, "I've got so much stuff, I'm never going to get through it in an hour," and they finish in 30 minutes because they speak at 100 miles an hour because they're nervous and they don't think they're going to get through it. So it's better to practice so you know you will get through it, and also to try and slow down. So I used to have a John Wayne quote, and I don't anymore because he's not as nice as we used to think he was apparently, but he used to say, "Start slow, talk low, and talk loud." And that's basically it. And look up and look at people's faces so that they know you're trying to engage you in the conversation, if you like. And don't read. So in some disciplines, people do literally just stand up there and read their dissertation or whatever it is, and I've been to talks like that and I find them excruciating. I feel like the person delivering them doesn't care and isn't putting any effort in. So of course they are, but it's not a style that works well in science or in research. Okay, do's and don'ts. I've been fidgeting a lot and I know, and I'm still working on it after all these years. So it's important to stand even in those little departmental meetings. A lot of people say, no, I just sit at the front. But it actually is better to project and deliver standing. And if you aren't tied to the microphone, it is good to move around a bit if you can have a lapel microphone so that you can turn away and point at things and demonstrate things. And if you are very fidgety, and I am a bit, it's good to clasp your hands and try not to and and mumble and look down and talk quietly. And in small spaces, try not to block the screen. So you do see that sometimes in small rooms, people stand right in front of the thing they're trying to demonstrate. Yeah, don't hide behind the lectern. And if you are very shaky, don't hold things and don't point things because that'll show up even more. And as I've said, don't apologise either because everyone knows you're doing the best you can. It's a bit like those dinner party apologists who say everything's awful, I'm sorry, the soup's so awful, and oh, I've burnt that, and then you tend to not enjoy it as much. So don't apologise to your audience. And here's our old treasurer, Peter Costello, demonstrating, in this case, how to speak to a graph without disengaging from the audience and without reading. So he knows his material, he's trying to point things out on that graph. That's what you should be doing with a graph. Okay, so in terms of trying to connect to your audience, if you're going to a conference you know no one, and especially if it's overseas, it's a really good idea to start by introducing yourself and thank them for the opportunity and make some general comment about how lovely it is to be in this beautiful city or this fabulous new hospital or whatever it might be. And as I said, just find a few faces that aren't asleep and don't look angry or stressed or on the phone, and try and gather people into your story and tell them why you are so interested in this and why it's important and what the journey was, what were the difficult things and how you got there in the end. If you are unlucky and you're in a massive conference and you've got the big room and there's 5 sessions on at once and you only have 25 people, try and gather them round a bit closer so that it's not so difficult to be looking here and there and everywhere. And if you are funny, which I'm not, but if you are lucky to be very funny, it's great to use humour, but beware. So another thing Australians do so well is sarcasm, and that doesn't work in some countries at all. They think you're being serious and it can go really badly. So just think about, and that's in English-speaking countries, so just beware about, if you're good at humour, great. If you're a bit unsure, maybe leave it out. But be enthusiastic about what you're doing, because that will make people far more interested in what you have to say. Problem people, yeah. So question time's a common time for problem people, and don't panic because the chair should be there to help you. Some people are just really annoying, and so it's important to be able to say, that's a good question, I'm not sure I have the answer for you, but I'll take that up with you afterwards and I'm going to move on to my next question, or something like that. You've got to stop people sometimes, because they'll just keep coming back and coming back. And with technical problems, remember you've got your chairperson for your session, hopefully, you've got your AV guy, hopefully, and you'll have your backup plan. So you should have your printout, your USB, your laptop, whatever it takes to have a backup plan in case there are problems. And when you finish, don't rush off. Always say to people, I'm happy to stay behind and ask questions, because that's often the most valuable time. People are often a bit shy or think you're in a hurry or they're in a hurry, but if you say I'm going to stay behind for 15 minutes, I'd be happy to talk to people then. That's great. And when you do finish your talk, thank the chairperson or the audience and have something pithy at the end, like your take-home messages, and then walk off gracefully and don't rush or fall down the stairs. Now this is supposed to say question time and the role of the chairperson. And I want to talk to you about do's and don'ts for question time. So, as I said, when you're practicing your talk, hopefully you've anticipated some questions already and thought about what you might say in response. Always know whether there is going to be formal question time, a panel of question time, or if there's no question time, organise it yourself, and make sure you leave enough time, if you've been allocated 10 minutes, that you call for questions if the chairperson doesn't. Chairperson should, but if they don't, then you can ask for questions. Do, as I said, look like you're enjoying yourself even if you're utterly terrified. And remember, if someone asks a very long-winded or 5-part question, or is just very rambly, or has an accent that's hard to understand, don't be frightened to ask people to repeat the question. That's really important. Or you might just say, you might to yourself say, I can only remember the first bit of that question, so say, I'll answer that first part first, and then I'll come back to you on the next parts. And as I said, clarify if it wasn't clear, and try and keep your answer short, because then you'll get more time for other questions. So a don't, which I've put in brackets here, is don't necessarily, some people say it's not a great idea to say, have I answered your question? Because then they might say no, and then you're going to spend more time on that question. So just do the best you can and move on. Don't bluff. It really makes you look bad if you say something that you've just made up on the spot that you don't have any basis in fact for. Try and just be honest and say, I actually don't know the answer to that question. Does anyone else in the audience have that expertise? Or I'd be happy to look that up and get back to you, speak to me afterwards. Yeah, and again, don't rush off. This is really important time. This is the most important time for your presentation. Okay, so what about the chairperson? So one day this might be you. You've probably chaired sessions already, some of you. But even if you're not the chairperson, you need to know what the chairperson should be doing. So a good chairperson should roll up quite early and have contacted all the speakers in advance and know who they are, and then find them and sit them all down the front, tell them when the bell's going to ring, if there's a time limit, what that's going to sound like, and that they will stop you if you go over, so that there's time for questions and it all runs to schedule. And then they should have particular roles sort of before, during and after your actual talk. So before, as I said, come early, start on time, get everyone to turn their mobile phones and beepers off, for big conferences especially, and the chairperson should introduce you and give a little bit of background on you, and should have checked that that's all accurate beforehand, and they should stay at the front to greet you or welcome you on. And then during, they should sit nearby and not like that. They should be alert and listening and respectful, and they will be watching the time, thinking about a question or two in case none come from the audience. They should be, if there's not an official timer, they should be watching the time and prepared to stop you. So a good chairperson will stop you, and we've all been to conferences where there's the chairperson, you know the speaker's going 15 minutes still after they should have stopped and nothing's been said, and that's really frustrating. And then afterwards they should ask for questions from the audience. If there are none, they should offer one themselves, but they should not hog the question time either. That's not good practice. And before question time even, they might repeat the main message. Great talk. I can see it's really important that you've found blah, blah, blah. Any questions? Thank the speaker before the end of the session, and then ideally send a message the next day to say thank you, which we always do for our speakers here, because it's a lot of effort. That slide I put up before we started the talk, about 30 hours for a 30-minute session, is about right. So if you're preparing a talk from scratch, it can take as many hours as it does minutes to speak, to deliver the talk, to prepare the talk for speaking, because you're thinking about creating graphs, distilling information, practicing, all the things you need to do, preparing a handout. It's a lot of work. And so feedback's really important, which is why we value your feedback at the end of our talks, because otherwise you can't learn, you can't improve your talk. And it's unusual to do a piece of research and only ever do one presentation, and you're often building on old talks when you do more research on the same topic. And if it doesn't go to plan, you know, that can be unpleasant, but you need to get back and practice again and make the changes straight away while they're fresh in your mind. I keep using the word practice, but yes, I think in terms of improvement, that's the best way forward, is just practice, be prepared to change what you've just done just today, go home, think about what you would do differently, change the order, whatever it is. Watch other people. So we all know people who are just fantastic speakers, who don't need any prompts, they can just get up and talk with no PowerPoint. What is it about them that you like in the way they deliver talks? And then for the speakers that are not so good, what are the things you want to avoid for yourself? And try the good things next time and try and avoid the not so good things. So it is all about preparation in terms of being confident, and also repetition, which I've just repeated. And again, as I said, if you're presenting to your peers or your department, think really carefully about using this technique where you allocate different roles to different people, because you'll get a lot more valuable feedback that way, instead of just saying, tell me what you think as a group. All right, so my take-home messages are, think about the whole story you want to get across and what are the main messages in that you would like people to retain, and make sure that that comes through very clearly, and that you deliver this story of your research on time in a simple, objective, scientific way, that you're very prepared and you have a backup plan in case things go wrong, that you make the effort to try and connect with your audience and at least look like you're enjoying yourself, even if you're not really. And do be confident about what the chairperson should be doing and how question time should be run, and try and make sure that happens even if you don't have a great chairperson. And of course, practice. And I'd like to thank Malcolm for stealing his slides at the start, and just let you know about our upcoming seminars. So that one from Elizabeth Chester, she is a fantastic speaker. She wouldn't be in comms if she wasn't. And it really is a fantastic talk about how to maximise the impact of your research and work with the media and the comms team to get your messages out there. So now I have 6 minutes for questions, because I practiced my talk and I knew I'd have about 6 minutes. If people had comments or questions, and I too would be happy to stay behind for anyone who feels shy and doesn't want to ask a question now. Does anyone have any comments or questions or want to share experiences of presenting, either offline or here in the auditorium? We've got a microphone.
Thank you so much for the presentation. It's been really helpful. We're all honours students studying in UWA in Curtin. I just have a query. So when we are presenting more than a conference, we're presenting to our markers, and because of the whole COVID, we have adapted to Zoom / in-person meetings as well. So do you have any specific tips in terms of delivery techniques via Zoom?
I had to listen to a PhD student via Zoom present a literature review recently, and I think the most important thing is to set yourself up really well so that you've got what you need in front of you. And obviously, if you can manage the split screen thing and have visuals to share as well as them being able to see you, that's really important. But the most important person for them to see is you. And you don't want to be looking down too much, so print things out in big enough font and try to be rehearsed enough that you don't have to read. It would be my advice. So if you're presenting, it should be a bit like this, that you have large font dot points in front of you that you already know how to talk around, you already know what it is you're going to say, and try, just like I have to here or like you would have to in a real situation, to make eye contact as much as you can tell you're making eye contact, which you can. And I know that when we did ours, often when you're in these rooms, there's a huge screen, so you have to be aware you're going to be on some huge screen and you're just looking at maybe 4 people sitting around a table drinking coffee and twiddling their thumbs. And don't get put off by people writing. So sometimes a good marking group will say, don't mind us, we'll just be jotting down notes, but it can be a bit off-putting if it looks like no one's watching you, but they'll just be looking up and down all the time. So again, just prepare the space well, and maybe try and do a practice one in advance. That would be a lot less stressful, I think, if you could get a friend to set up something similar and just make sure all the technology works and everything. Yeah.
Thank you.
That's all right. Does anyone else have any additional things to add to that? No? Any other comments or queries or experiences?
There's just one question online. It was how many minutes per slide do you normally allocate?
Yeah. So usually 1 minute per slide is what we recommend. So if you've got a 60-minute talk like me, you should have about 60 slides, and that means you can spend more on some than others, and that means a lot of hours of preparation. For a really short conference talk, which is like 8 minutes, you might have 8 to 10 slides, because your introduction and your title slide, you're already talking, and your acknowledgement slide at the end, you're already asking for questions. So 8 to 10 slides, but they say roughly 1 minute per slide, and practice will enable you to do that.
Thank you so much for your talk. I have another question about the acronyms and the abbreviations. I know you mentioned that you should try and avoid them, but if your entire project, let's say about a specific disease that has an abbreviation, would you use the abbreviation throughout the slide, or would you say just the
It depends how long it is. If it's only 3 words or 2 words, then I would still try and spell them out. If it's an extremely well-known acronym and you're confident of your audience knowing that acronym, then it becomes less of an issue. But as much as possible, spell things out. So even when I do our good clinical practice talk, that's the sort of international standards for conducting research, everyone in the game just calls it GCP, but I have had people go to talks on GCP saying, I didn't even know what it was about until I got halfway through when someone finally said good clinical practice. So you have to be very confident of your audience, that's all. So if it's your presentation of your degree, then hopefully the people marking it will know exactly what you're talking about. That would be different. But if you've got a big audience and it's broad, and it's likely that 30% of people won't know those acronyms, then I try not to use them at all, especially if you've only got a dozen slides. It's okay to write it out and take up a whole line, or perhaps you could even put it across the bottom of the slide if you have to use it to save space on precious dot point and 8 words.
Thank you.
Any other comments? Questions? Horrific experiences you'd like to share? Up here, Melissa.
Thank you for the good talk. I just have a question on the use of cartoons, when especially you are presenting to a lay audience. How far do you go with the use of cartoons just to sometimes because you can oversimplify, especially in science. So what do you think about
Do you
use
mean
of
not funny ha-ha cartoons?
Yeah,
you mean
just funny cartoons.
Oh, okay. So my previous admin person loved putting cartoons on all my slides, and I still have a few, and I took a few off because some of them weren't so funny. But they can be useful, but they are a distraction. So you do have to balance up the talk being incredibly dull all the way through with just having the odd amusing quote or the odd amusing image. Then on the other hand, people use cartoons or animations to simplify things sometimes, you know, even for data presentation or whatever. So there are roles for it. And I think in a 10-minute talk, I wouldn't be bothering with cartoons, but in a 1-hour talk at lunchtime when everyone's trying desperately not to fall asleep, the odd bit of humour or the odd quote or two can be useful. So it's just a balance. And when you practice your talk, people will tell you, I thought that was a bit naff and I would take that out if I was you. Or they'll just say that was distracting or I wouldn't put that in there. So personally, I think I could de-cartoon a few of my slides, but we haven't had any complaints. But I definitely wouldn't put them in short talks because I think, you know, you've got a very short time to get your message across. You don't want distractions. No one's expecting full-on film entertainment. They're just expecting to get the facts in a short time. Okay, it's past, so we might stop it there. Thank you for everyone who came in person and everyone online out there. And please take a moment, if you haven't registered in person, if you have registered in person, you will have received an email on your phone already just to tick the boxes for us or give us any comments, and otherwise you can go to that link there or to our website. And as I said, all our talks are up there all the time, so feel free to have a look and see if there's anything else that might help you in your research journey. Thank you.